I would like to invite Ms. Aditi Tandon. Aditi is a production editor with the environment news portal Mongabay, the India network. She has over 15 years of experience in media and communications, and she's also a fact-checking trainer with Google News Initiative, the India Training Network. So over to you, Aditi. Please use this forum to explain how you are trying to tackle this menace.
Thank you, Ghazala. So hello, everyone. Thanks for taking time to join in today. And thank you to Global Media Education Council for this session on a very important issue of media misinformation and climate change. It's not spoken about enough, but I think it is growing. And I will talk more about what I have observed by working at Mongabay, India. So I'm a journalist with Mongabay India, which is an environment news portal. And like Ghazala mentioned, I'm a fact-checking trainer with the Google News Initiatives India Training Network. And since I work with an environment publication specifically, we observe climate change related news, research, policy, narratives every day. And when the topic of climate misinformation comes up, a lot of people, including friends in the media, ask us that, is climate misinformation really a big problem in India? Because in India, we've seen, how political or health-related misinformation has become widespread. And comparatively, climate misinformation is not so widespread or problematic in India yet. And I say yet because through my conversations and research and stories on this subject, it could be a problem very soon. Globally, it is already a problem. And it's not because people don't believe in climate change. So we've moved on from that climate denial phase that used to be there in the US and certain other countries. The reasons now are different. People are people or organizations are spreading climate misinformation, either for creating an environment for polarization. And in that polarized environment, political or communal misinformation also gets traction, or they're doing it for monetary benefit. And there are funders of climate misinformation in some countries. In India, we don't see that too much as yet. What we do see often in India is a poor interpretation of science or using incomplete context when explaining climate science. We're seeing this in India, and in media specifically, we don't have too many specialized journalists on the subject, but that is okay, as in not every journalist is supposed to know all the science. But what we're expected to do, and again, this comes into the education sphere and literacy about media, even as journalists, we are expected to investigate, we're expected to ask enough questions, and we're expected to explain information to make the science accessible to readers without compromising on accuracy. And I'd just like to share a short presentation because there's some examples that I'd like to share. Is everyone able to see these examples? Ghazala also brought them up. In case you're not able to see them, please just unmute and let me know. So these are two examples I wanted to highlight from the very recent COP26, the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow that ended early this month. Both these images, one of diesel generators on the left and one of clusters of aeroplanes on the right, were being circulated with misleading captions. And they were debunked, but the intent was obvious that there are attempts to undermine this climate negotiation process. That in turn would reduce support from the public. It would confuse public, make them wonder, is this really required? Is a conference of parties really required? And with that lowering support, action on climate change would get delayed. So like I mentioned, there's no longer an outright denial of climate change. People have come to the consensus, more or less, that yes, it exists. But there are efforts to delay any action on it. There are efforts to undermine conferences which try and take action towards it. And this was perhaps the first COP where climate misinformation was being observed and analyzed by global groups. There was attempts to bring in, a formalization of climate misinformation. And also the reason why this has become very important is because the people analyzing this climate misinformation have realized that the tactics used for climate misinformation globally are the same as the tactics used in extremist content or migration related misinformation. So they're seeing the same kind of tactics using climate as the subject, and that's where there is concern that this could become something worse than what it already is. So on the screen, I've just listed some of the trends that were noticed. Of course, misleading images and videos were being circulated, which has become the norm with every major event these days. But what analysts also noticed was there was an increase in conflict of ideologies or culture wars, as they're called. So it was either between countries, between the global north versus global south, so blocks of countries, youth activists versus corporates. And the basis of many of these conflicts was often true, but the narrative that either the country or the media or certain actors looking to delay progress took was polarizing. And in this polarized narrative, which is like, it's not us, it's them kind of narrative, what it creates is a situation where misinformation can come in, where it can thrive, where it prevents collective action from happening, which is the core of a conference like this. And the purpose of a conference like this gets derailed. There was greenwashing, which is basically putting out information that sounds like a solution, but doesn't actually work. And much of this was done to pollute the information landscape, to confuse people, and to delay action, and to reduce public support for climate change on a global platform. And before I talk a little about what we can do as media or as educators to prevent misinformation, I just want to raise why climate misinformation particularly is problematic. Some of this we see with most kinds of misinformation that's out there. So inaccurate information, whether it's climate or otherwise, it confuses people. They don't know whom to trust, and there's so much of information overload that it becomes difficult to get to the accurate information. Climate misinformation specifically, it undermines work of scientists, and the trust in science goes down, which is again a dangerous path to go along. And more dangerous is that it becomes a subject to fuel polarization, like was mentioned earlier as well. We've seen it in other types of misinformation. We've seen that when there is this kind of polarization, what the subject is somehow gets lost by the end of it. It just becomes a tool to attack us and them. And even worse is that it can reduce public support for any policy or any action towards climate change. And overall, it causes delays in action. And this delay benefits certain parties. And whether it's fossil fuel companies or other people with interests in keeping climate action at bay, it supports their agenda in a subtle way. So where do you start? Like, what do you do? And this is a question we get very often because it is not easy. Climate change is not an easy subject. It is a very complex and a very nuanced subject. And people are not, people including me also, I would say, working in the environment space, it's difficult to wrap your head around every nuance of everything about climate change. But a few things that as journalists or as media people or as media educators that we can do is, before actually getting to reporting or fact checking, develop a healthy sense of skepticism. I think this is across subjects. It's just a core of journalism, about asking questions, about investigating, just being skeptical of information that is put in front of you. And of course, educating yourself a bit more on the subject, because right now climate misinformation has not hit us the way it has hit some other countries. But if we, to use a COVID word, inoculate ourselves against this by educating ourselves, by reading up, by looking at multiple opinions on the issue, by reading diverse opinions and diverse media, it would help us develop a sense of what climate change and its nuances are, which could help us, when misinformation comes our way, we can be like, okay, I've read about this, let me investigate further and ask more questions. And one way to do due diligence on the sources, it's important to make sure that are they really experts on the subject? Do they have an agenda? Because this is something that is seen in climate change reporting, where an expert may not be really an expert and or may be funded by someone for speaking on a certain subject or speaking against a certain subject. So it's important to do due diligence on the subject. It's important to get into the technical details, because climate change is a technical topic. And from my experience, what I've seen is that we are often afraid to ask questions to scientists or to people who have technical expertise, because we feel maybe we don't understand enough. It sounds like a silly question, but it's not. As journalists, our job is to ask questions to make it simple for ourselves before we go out and make it simple for the audience. And so it's absolutely fine to get into very specific details about where was the location, what is the methodology, what does this number mean. And one thing which I've put here is that all that's green, all that we're taught about environment, which is, plant a lot of trees and all of that, it's not necessarily always good. And I've, given the example of planting trees. I just mentioned it because if a scientist says plant 1 million trees, we can save the environment, it sounds like a great thing. But as a journalist, we cannot take that at face value. There are many layers to it. What are the kind of trees? Because if you plant the wrong kind of tree, it can harm the local biodiversity. Where is it being planted? All these are questions to ask. And I've put an example of a story on Assam floods, which was portrayed in 2 different ways in Indian media at the same time. One talks about why annual floods are essential, and one talks about the devastating effect of annual floods. So even if you imagine floods as being devastating, that's the obvious narrative to take because that's what we've been taught. But when you explore further, there are, and Indian Express covered this, and Mongabay India also covered this, about why annual floods are essential for the survival of this national park and the biodiversity in Assam. And before closing up, I'd like to share a link. I'll probably do it in the chat about a story we did recently about climate misinformation at COP26, which goes into details of some of the things I spoke about. And with that, I'd just like to end this presentation. I hope I've kept it within time.